Your scholarship has been revoked effective immediately. The email notification lit up my phone screen just as I walked across the graduation stage at Stanford University. 4 years of sleepless nights, part-time jobs, and academic excellence had led to this moment, receiving my computer science degree summa cum laude. Now, with my diploma literally in hand and my family cheering from the audience, I learned that my full-ride scholarship had been stripped away, leaving me with a $180,000 debt that would be due within 30 days. The sender? Derek Hawthorne, Assistant Director of Financial Aid and son of the university's biggest donor. The same Derek who'd made my last semester a living hell after I'd refused his romantic advances. The same Derek who'd promised to make me regret embarrassing him when I'd reported his inappropriate behavior to the dean. I showed the message to my parents as we stood in the post-ceremony crowd. My mother, Maria, a night shift nurse who'd worked double shifts to support my education, went pale. Her hands, calloused from years of caring for patients, trembled as she held my phone. My father, Roberto, a construction foreman who'd taken on weekend projects to help with my living expenses, read the message 3 times before speaking. "Mia, there has to be a mistake," he said in Spanish, his voice shaking. "You've never failed a class. Your GPA is perfect. How can they do this?" But I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was revenge, calculated and cruel. Derek had waited until the exact moment when I'd feel most triumphant to deliver his blow. What he didn't know was that his timing would prove to be a catastrophic error in judgment that would ultimately cost him everything, while launching me into a future I never could have imagined. Before I continue with what happened next, let me give you some context about how this nightmare began and why Derek Hawthorne made such a fatal miscalculation. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and until that graduation day, I was the poster child for Stanford's diversity and inclusion programs. I'd grown up in East Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where college wasn't just rare, it was almost mythical. The daughter of hardworking Mexican immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they'd never had, I understood from an early age that education was my only path to a different life. My parents had arrived in California with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief that America was a place where hard work could overcome any obstacle. My father took construction jobs that paid under the table because his English wasn't perfect and his credentials from Mexico weren't recognized. My mother cleaned houses during the day and took English classes at night, dreaming of someday working in healthcare. Their sacrifices weren't lost on me. While other kids complained about homework, I saw it as my contribution to the family's future. When my elementary school teachers told my parents I had exceptional aptitude for mathematics and problem solving, they found ways to get me into advanced programs despite the cost and transportation challenges. The first computer I ever touched was in the public library when I was 10 years old. While other kids played games, I discovered coding tutorials online. Something about the logical structure of programming languages spoke to me in a way that nothing else ever had. By 12, I was spending every free moment at that library, teaching myself HTML, then CSS, then JavaScript, gradually working my way up to more complex languages. My uncle Miguel, my father's brother who worked as a janitor at a tech company, noticed my obsession with computers. One day, he arrived at our apartment with an ancient laptop that his employer was throwing away. "It's slow and the screen flickers," he told me, "but it might be useful for practice." That laptop became my window to a wider world. I learned to repair it when components failed, upgrading it piece by piece with parts I found at electronics recycling centers. More importantly, I used it to take every free online programming course I could find. While my classmates were worried about social media and teenage drama, I was building websites for local businesses and teaching myself advanced algorithms. My high school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was the first person outside my family to suggest that I might have a shot at Stanford. "Your test scores are exceptional, Isabella," she told me during my junior year. "Your programming portfolio is already more sophisticated than what many college graduates produce. You should be thinking about top-tier universities." The idea seemed impossible. Students from my neighborhood didn't go to Stanford. They went to community college if they were lucky, maybe transferred to a state school if they worked hard enough. Elite universities were for rich kids from Palo Alto, not scholarship cases from East LA. But Mrs. Patterson wouldn't let the idea die. She helped me navigate the application process, explaining concepts like demonstrated need and extracurricular activities. She wrote recommendation letters that painted a picture of my potential that I couldn't see in myself. Most importantly, she helped me understand that my background wasn't a disadvantage to hide. It was a strength to showcase. The day my Stanford acceptance letter arrived, along with a full scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and living expenses, our entire apartment building celebrated. Mrs. Head Gonzalez from next door brought over tamales. Mr. Kim from downstairs offered to drive me to campus when the time came. My parents cried tears of joy and pride, seeing their American dream finally taking concrete shape. I arrived at Stanford feeling like an imposter among students who spoke casually about their parents' careers at tech companies and investment banks. My roommate, Madison, was friendly enough, but her stories about family vacations in Europe and summer programs at elite prep schools made me acutely aware of how different our backgrounds were. The academic transition was challenging, but manageable. Stanford's computer science program was rigorous, but I'd been preparing for this level of difficulty for years. What I hadn't prepared for was the social navigation required to succeed in an environment where networking mattered as much as grades. I learned quickly to observe and adapt. I noticed which professors responded well to intellectual curiosity versus those who preferred structured questions. I identified which student organizations offered genuine learning opportunities versus those that were primarily social clubs for wealthy students. Most importantly, I learned to translate my experiences into language that resonated with my new environment. By sophomore year, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. My grades placed me in the top 5% of my class. I'd secured a research position with Dr. Sarah Kim, whose work on machine learning applications in cybersecurity aligned perfectly with my interests. I was tutoring other students and working as a teaching assistant, earning money while building my resume. The scholarship recipients' dinner during my sophomore year was where I first encountered Derek Hawthorne. These quarterly events were designed to connect scholarship students with donors and university administrators, fostering relationships that would theoretically benefit both parties. Derek attended as a representative of the Hawthorne Foundation, his family's charitable organization that had donated over $50 million to Stanford over 2 decades. At 28, Derek cut an impressive figure. Tall and well-dressed, with the easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He moved through the reception like someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His Stanford MBA was prominently displayed in his office, along with photos of him with various university dignitaries and Silicon Valley celebrities. Derek's approach to the scholarship students was carefully calibrated. He asked thoughtful questions about our studies and career goals, demonstrating just enough knowledge about our fields to seem genuinely interested. With me, he focused on the intersection of computer science and social justice, suggesting that technology could be a powerful tool for addressing inequality. Students like you are why the Hawthorne Foundation focuses on education, he told me that first evening. You're not just learning to code, you're learning to solve problems that matter. That's exactly the kind of thinking Silicon Valley needs more of. His attention felt validating. Here was someone connected to the university's power structure who saw value in my perspective and potential. When he suggested we continue our conversation over coffee the following week, I saw it as a mentorship opportunity that could open doors I didn't even know existed. Our first coffee meeting at Coupa Cafe seemed perfectly appropriate. Derek asked about my research with Dr. Kim, my thoughts on the ethics of artificial intelligence, and my plans for summer internships. He shared insights about the tech industry that weren't available in textbooks, describing the cultural dynamics at major companies and the unwritten rules that determined who succeeded and who didn't. The biggest mistake brilliant students make, he told me, is thinking that technical skills alone will get them where they want to go. The reality is that relationships matter just as much as capabilities. The students who understand that early have a huge advantage. He offered to introduce me to Stanford alumni working at companies I'd never be able to reach through normal recruiting channels. He mentioned exclusive networking events where scholarship recipients could meet potential mentors and employers. All of this felt like exactly the kind of opportunity Mrs. Howdesech Patterson had encouraged me to pursue. The second meeting, 2 weeks later, felt subtly different. Derek chose a more intimate coffee shop in downtown Palo Alto, one with softer lighting and comfortable armchairs arranged around small tables. His questions became more personal, focusing on my family background and my adjustment to Stanford's social environment. It must be challenging, he said, leaning forward with what seemed like genuine concern, being so far from home, both geographically and culturally. Do you feel like you fit in here? The question touched on insecurities I rarely acknowledged, even to myself. The truth was that I often felt like I was performing a role rather than being myself. I'd learned to dress like my classmates, to speak about my experiences in terms that translated well to this environment, to hide aspects of my background that might make me seem too different. Derek seemed to understand this without my having to explain it explicitly. He shared stories about other scholarship students he'd mentored, describing their struggles with imposter syndrome and their eventual success once they learned to leverage their unique perspectives. The students who do best, he said, are the ones who learn to be strategic about relationships. Not manipulative. Strategic. There's a difference. As winter quarter progressed, these coffee meetings became a regular occurrence. Derek would text me articles about developments in tech that he thought would interest me. He'd mention job opportunities at companies where the Hawthorne Foundation had connections. He began inviting me to events, not just university functions, but private gatherings where scholarship recipients could meet donor families and successful alumni. The first red flag I should have noticed was how Derek positioned himself at these events. Rather than introducing me to other mentors or potential connections, he seemed focused on being my primary contact with this world. When other attendees showed interest in my research or background, Derek would subtly steer conversations back to himself or suggest that they follow up through him. During my junior year, Derek's behavior began to shift in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Our coffee meetings moved from discussing academic and career topics to more personal territory. He'd ask about my dating life, my social activities, whether I felt lonely being so far from home. When I mentioned that I was focused on my studies and research rather than social relationships, he seemed to interpret this as an invitation rather than a boundary. "You know, Isabella," he said during one particularly uncomfortable conversation, "you're incredibly mature for your age. Most students your age are so focused on parties and superficial relationships. You understand what really matters." The compliment felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate at the time. Looking back, I realized he was grooming me, using a combination of flattery and isolation to make me dependent on his validation and guidance. The spring of my junior year brought new opportunities that should have been exciting, but instead became sources of stress due to Derek's increasing involvement in my academic life. I'd been selected for a prestigious summer internship at Google, working on their machine learning team in Mountain View. The position came with a substantial salary, housing assistance, and potential for a full-time offer upon graduation. Derek's reaction to this news was revealing. Rather than congratulating me, his first response was concern about how the internship might affect our mentoring relationship. "These big tech companies can be overwhelming," he warned. "They have a way of consuming people, especially young women who don't have strong support networks. You'll need someone outside the company who understands the landscape, someone who can give you perspective when things get challenging." He suggested we maintain regular contact throughout the summer, with weekly video calls to discuss my experiences and challenges. He positioned this as essential mentoring support, but something about his insistence felt possessive, rather than protective. The Google internship was transformative in ways Derek couldn't have anticipated. Working alongside some of the brightest minds in technology, I discovered that my skills and insights were not only competitive, but often superior to those of my peers from more privileged backgrounds. My unique perspective, shaped by growing up in a community that tech rarely considered, allowed me to identify problems and solutions that others missed. My project focused on developing algorithms to detect fraudulent financial transactions, particularly those targeting low-income communities. The work combined my technical skills with my lived experience, creating solutions that were both innovative and socially impactful. By midsummer, my supervisor was discussing the possibility of publishing our results and potentially patenting the algorithm I developed. More importantly, I was building relationships with Google employees who saw my potential and wanted to support my career development. These mentors were nothing like Derek. They offered guidance without expecting anything in return, connected me with opportunities without trying to control them, and treated me as a colleague rather than a subordinate. The contrast became stark during one of Derek's weekly check-in calls. I'd been excited to share news about my project's progress and the positive feedback I was receiving from senior engineers. Instead of celebrating my success, Derek seemed threatened by it. "You need to be careful about getting too confident," he warned. "These companies sometimes build up interns just to tear them down later. Don't let temporary success go to your head." His negativity felt toxic after spending weeks surrounded by people who believed in my capabilities. For the first time, I began to question Derek's motives and the nature of our relationship. The turning point came during a Google networking event in late July. I was mingling with full-time employees and other interns, discussing machine learning applications and career opportunities, when Derek appeared unexpectedly. He'd driven down from Stanford without telling me, claiming he happened to be in the area for meetings. His presence at the event felt intrusive and inappropriate. He inserted himself into my conversations with Google employees, positioning himself as my mentor and guardian in ways that made me cringe. When a senior engineer mentioned potential full-time opportunities for promising interns, Derek suggested that I wasn't ready for such a commitment and would benefit from graduate school first. After the event, Derek insisted on driving me back to my housing, despite my protests that I had planned to continue networking with other attendees. During the drive, his behavior became increasingly possessive and inappropriate. "I'm concerned about the influence these people are having on you," he said. "You're starting to sound arrogant, like you think you're better than the opportunities Stanford can provide. That kind of attitude will hurt you in the long run." His criticism felt like manipulation designed to undermine my growing confidence and independence. When I defended my performance and the positive feedback I'd received, Derek's response was revealing. "Isabella, you need to remember who's been supporting you throughout this process. Without the connections and guidance I've provided, you'd still be struggling to navigate Stanford's social dynamics. A little gratitude wouldn't be inappropriate." The entitlement in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't offering mentorship. He was expecting payment for services I'd never requested. I completed my Google internship with outstanding reviews and a standing offer for full-time employment upon graduation. My algorithm had been approved for patent application, with my name listed as the primary inventor. Most importantly, I'd built a network of genuine mentors who supported my growth without expecting anything in return. Returning to Stanford for my senior year, I was determined to establish boundaries with Derek while maintaining the professional relationships that were legitimately beneficial to my career. I hoped that Derek would recognize my growth and adjust his approach accordingly. I was naive to think it would be that simple. Derek's behavior during my senior year became increasingly erratic and inappropriate. He seemed threatened by my newfound confidence and independence, interpreting my professional growth as personal rejection. Our coffee meetings became uncomfortable confrontations, where he would criticize my career choices and question my loyalty to the people who had made my success possible. "You're making a mistake if you think Google really cares about you," he told me during one particularly tense conversation. "They're using you for diversity statistics. When it comes time for real advancement, they'll choose someone who fits their culture better." His comments weren't just wrong. They were designed to undermine my confidence and make me doubt the validity of my achievements. When I pushed back, pointing out that my performance and recognition were based on concrete results rather than demographics, Derek's response revealed the depth of his entitlement and resentment. "You're being naive, Isabella. The tech industry is more political than you realize. You need allies who understand how things really work. Burning bridges with people who've invested in your success is a career-limiting move." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Derek was suggesting that my career prospects depended on maintaining our relationship on his terms. The situation escalated during the fall quarter when Derek began showing up at events and locations where he had no legitimate reason to be present. He'd appear at computer science department functions, claiming to be evaluating scholarship recipients. He'd suggest meetings to discuss my post-graduation planning with increasing frequency and urgency. The final straw came in November during a department awards ceremony where I was being honored for my research with Dr. Kim. Derek attended despite having no official role in the event, positioned himself near the reception area and approached me as I was leaving. "Isabella, we need to talk," he said, grasping my arm as I tried to move past him. "You've been avoiding me, and it's starting to affect your scholarship status." The physical contact and the explicit threat crossed lines I could no longer ignore. When I pulled away and told him his behavior was inappropriate, Derek's facade of professional concern finally cracked completely. "You think you're too good for the people who made your success possible," he said, his voice rising enough to attract attention from other attendees. "You think your Google friends are going to protect you? Let me explain how this really works." He proceeded to detail exactly how much influence the Hawthorne Foundation had over Stanford's financial aid decisions, scholarship renewals, and graduate program admissions. He described his father's relationships with university administrators and board members. Most chillingly, he explained how students who showed poor judgment in their relationships with donor families often found their Stanford experience becoming significantly more difficult. "Your scholarship renewal isn't automatic," he concluded. "It requires annual review and approval. I'd hate to see you lose everything you've worked for because of a misunderstanding about professional relationships." The threat was explicit and unmistakable. Derek was using his family's financial influence over the university to coerce my compliance with his inappropriate behavior. I left the reception immediately and spent the rest of the evening researching my options. Stanford's policies on harassment and retaliation were comprehensive in theory, but vague about enforcement when powerful donors were involved. The stories I found online suggested that complaints against well-connected individuals often resulted in minimal consequences for the perpetrators and significant retaliation against the complainants. Despite these concerns, I knew I had to report Derek's behavior. His threats were escalating, and I couldn't continue my education under the constant stress of his harassment and manipulation. The next morning, I made an appointment with Dean Patricia Williams, Stanford's Deputy Dean of Student Affairs. Dean Williams had a reputation for taking student concerns seriously and had been involved in several high-profile cases involving misconduct by faculty and staff. The meeting took place in Dean Williams' office, a space designed to feel both professional and welcoming. Family photos and academic awards lined the shelves, while comfortable chairs arranged around a small table created an atmosphere conducive to difficult conversations. Dean Williams listened to my account with growing concern, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of the serious nature of Derek's behavior. She was particularly interested in the timeline of escalation and the specific threats Derek had made regarding my scholarship status. "Isabella, what you're describing constitutes harassment and potentially criminal coercion," she said after I finished my account. "The university takes such allegations extremely seriously, especially when they involve abuse of institutional power." Her response was reassuring, but I detected a note of concern in her voice when she asked about Derek's family connections to the university. "I want to be transparent with you about the complexities we're facing," she continued. "Investigating allegations against someone whose family has significant influence requires careful handling to ensure fairness for all parties while protecting you from retaliation." Dean Williams explained the formal complaint process, emphasizing that the university had policies specifically designed to protect students from retaliation during investigations. She assured me that my scholarship status could not be affected by filing a complaint and that any attempt to use financial aid as a weapon would itself constitute additional misconduct. "We've handled similar situations before," she told me. "The key is thorough documentation and careful adherence to established procedures. I'm confident we can resolve this appropriately while protecting your interests." I filed the formal complaint that afternoon. providing detailed written accounts of Derek's behavior, along with supporting evidence, including text messages, emails, and documentation of his appearances at events where he had no legitimate business. The investigation process was supposed to take 30 days, during which Derek would be informed of the allegations and given an opportunity to respond. Dean Williams assured me that I would be kept informed of significant developments and that interim measures would be implemented to prevent further contact between Derek and me. For 2 weeks, the system seemed to work as designed. Derek's inappropriate communications stopped completely. He no longer appeared at computer science department events. The constant stress that had been affecting my academic performance began to diminish. Then everything changed. Dean Williams called me back to her office exactly 3 weeks after I'd filed my complaint. Her demeanor was noticeably different, more formal, less warm, with an underlying tension that hadn't been present during our initial meeting. "Isabella, I wanted to update you on the status of your complaint," she began, consulting notes that she kept carefully positioned so I couldn't read them. "We've completed our preliminary investigation and interviewed all relevant parties." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Hawthorne has acknowledged that his communications with you may have been inappropriate and has agreed to modify his behavior going forward. He's enrolled in professional development training focused on appropriate interactions with students, and his direct involvement with scholarship recipient events will be limited." The language was carefully crafted to sound like accountability while actually describing minimal consequences. When I asked about the specific threats Derek had made regarding my scholarship status, Dean Williams' response was evasive. Mr. Hawthorne disputes that characterization of his comments. He maintains that he was offering career guidance, though he acknowledges that his communication style may have been unclear. The investigation's conclusion felt like a betrayal of everything Dean Williams had promised during our initial meeting. Derek's behavior was being reframed as a communication problem rather than harassment and coercion. His threats were being dismissed as misunderstandings rather than abuse of power. "What about accountability?" I asked. "What consequences will he face for using his family's influence to threaten my scholarship?" Dean Williams' response revealed the true dynamics at play. The university values its relationship with the Hawthorne Foundation and appreciates their continued support of student opportunities. "We believe this situation can be resolved through improved communication and professional development rather than punitive measures." In other words, Derek's family's $50 million in donations was more valuable to Stanford than protecting students from harassment and coercion. I left Dean Williams' office feeling betrayed and vulnerable. The formal complaint process I'd been assured would protect me had instead demonstrated exactly how powerless I was when facing someone with Derek's connections and influence. Worse, I began to suspect that filing the complaint had actually made my situation more dangerous rather than safer. My suspicions were confirmed 2 weeks later when I received the first email from Derek's office requesting updated financial documentation for scholarship recipients. The timing wasn't coincidental. Derek was already laying the groundwork for his retaliation. The second email arrived a week later, this one more urgent and specific about potential scholarship review processes. When I consulted with financial aid counselors about these requests, their responses were evasive and unhelpful. "Sometimes there are administrative reviews that require additional documentation," one counselor told me. "It's probably just routine, but you should make sure to respond promptly if they request anything specific." The bureaucratic language couldn't hide what was really happening. Derek was using his position and influence to create a paper trail that would justify revoking my scholarship while making it appear to be based on legitimate administrative concerns rather than retaliation. As graduation approached, the stress of the situation was overwhelming. I was trying to complete my senior thesis, maintain my perfect GPA, and navigate job interviews while constantly worrying about Derek's next move. The anticipation was almost worse than the harassment itself. I knew he was planning something devastating, but I couldn't predict when or how he would strike. The Google job offer had evolved into something even better than I'd originally hoped. My internship supervisor, Dr. Lisa Chang, had been promoted to Director of AI Ethics and wanted me to join her team as a senior research engineer. The position came with a substantial salary, equity options, and the opportunity to work on projects that aligned perfectly with my interests and values. "Your work last summer opened up entirely new research directions," Dr. Chang told me during our final interview. "We want to build a team around the kind of thinking you demonstrated. This isn't just a job offer, it's a chance to shape the future of ethical AI development." The opportunity was everything I dreamed of, and more. But Derek's threats cast a shadow over what should have been the culmination of 4 years of hard work and sacrifice. 3 days before graduation, I received Derek's final communication before the scholarship revocation. A brief email requesting that I schedule a meeting to discuss post-graduation administrative requirements. The message was carefully worded to seem routine, but I knew it was Derek's last attempt to manipulate me before delivering his ultimate punishment. I didn't respond to the email. There was nothing Derek could say that would change my decision to pursue the opportunities I'd earned through my own merit rather than submit to his coercion and abuse. Graduation day itself was bittersweet. Walking across that stage, receiving my diploma summa cum laude, seeing my parents' pride and joy. It should have been pure triumph. Instead, I was waiting for Derek's final blow, knowing that he'd chosen this moment specifically to maximize the emotional impact. When the scholarship revocation email arrived just hours after the ceremony, I felt a mixture of devastation and relief. Devastation because Derek had successfully turned my greatest achievement into a source of financial crisis. Relief because the uncertainty was finally over and I could begin fighting back. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his timing had created the perfect opportunity for me to expose his abuse while protecting myself from its consequences. During my senior year, while dealing with Derek's escalating harassment, I'd been quietly building relationships and opportunities that existed completely outside his sphere of influence. The most important of these was my connection with James Chen, a Stanford alumnus whose story paralleled my own in important ways. James had contacted me in February, after reading about my research in the Stanford Daily. As the founder of Chen Cybersecurity, a successful firm specializing in fraud detection and prevention, he was interested in the algorithms I developed during my Google internship. Your approach to identifying financial fraud targeting vulnerable communities is exactly what the industry needs, he told me during our first phone conversation. Most cybersecurity solutions are designed by and for people who've never experienced financial vulnerability. Your perspective is invaluable. What started as a professional conversation evolved into something much more significant when James learned about my background and experiences at Stanford. As someone who'd also been the first in his family to attend elite universities, he understood the unique challenges faced by students like me. The hardest part isn't getting in, he explained during our first in-person meeting. It's navigating the politics and power structures once you're there, especially when you don't have family connections to protect you. James had spent the 5 years since graduating from Stanford building not just his company, but a network of support for students from underrepresented backgrounds. He'd quietly mentored dozens of students, helping them navigate academic and social challenges while building professional opportunities that existed outside traditional power structures. The system is designed to make students like us dependent on people like Derek, he explained. The key is building alternatives that can't be taken away by anyone else's whims or prejudices. Our conversations throughout the spring focused on both immediate opportunities and long-term strategy. James offered me a position at Chen Cybersecurity that would allow me to continue developing fraud detection algorithms while earning a salary that exceeded most entry-level tech positions. More intriguingly, he proposed a partnership opportunity that would go far beyond traditional employment. James was expanding into educational technology, developing platforms to help first-generation college students navigate higher education and career transitions. He wanted me to lead the technical development while maintaining equity in the venture. What you've experienced with Derek isn't unique, he explained. Students from backgrounds like ours face systematic abuse and manipulation, but they usually suffer in silence because they can't afford to fight back. We can change that dynamic. The partnership offer included a signing bonus, large enough to cover any potential debt Derek might try to saddle me with. More importantly, it represented an opportunity to transform my personal experience of harassment and retaliation into a systematic solution that could protect other students. When Derek's scholarship revocation email arrived on graduation day, I already had the resources and support network necessary to neutralize his attack. Within hours of receiving his message, I was on the phone with James, setting in motion a response that would expose Derek's abuse while launching the next phase of my career. Don't worry about the debt, James told me immediately after I explained the situation. We'll handle that today. More importantly, this is exactly why we need to build what we're building. Students like you shouldn't be vulnerable to people like Derek. By the time my family and I returned home from the graduation ceremony, James had already arranged for his company's legal team to wire the full amount of my debt to Stanford's bursar office. The payment wasn't structured as a loan, but as an advance on my signing bonus, meaning Derek's attempt to trap me financially had been completely neutralized. But James's response went far beyond simply paying off my debt. That evening, while I was still processing the emotional whiplash of graduation and financial crisis, he outlined a comprehensive strategy for exposing Derek's behavior while building something meaningful from the experience. This isn't just about getting revenge, he explained. It's about creating systematic change that prevents other students from going through what you've experienced. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than fighting Derek through Stanford's compromised internal processes, we would build an external system that documented and exposed patterns of abuse while providing resources and support for affected students. My first assignment as James's partner was developing the technical infrastructure for what would become the most comprehensive database of university misconduct and retaliation in the country. Using my expertise in machine learning and data analysis, I created algorithms that could identify patterns of abuse, track relationships between perpetrators and institutional power structures, and connect affected students with legal and financial resources. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Derek's retaliation was directly funding the development of the system that would ultimately expose him and others like him. As we built the platform throughout the summer and fall, James connected me with other students and alumni who'd experienced similar situations. Each story followed a depressingly familiar pattern: vulnerable students targeted by those in power, retaliation disguised as academic or financial consequences, victims forced into silence by their precarious positions. Sarah Martinez's scholarship had been revoked after she reported a professor's son for academic fraud. Kevin Washington had been expelled on fabricated disciplinary charges after refusing to complete assignments for wealthy classmates. Maria Gonzalez had been blacklisted from graduate programs after filing a sexual harassment complaint against a faculty member whose family were major donors. Each case we documented revealed the same fundamental dynamic. Elite universities' dependence on wealthy donors created systematic vulnerabilities that enabled abuse while protecting perpetrators. But our platform was changing that balance of power. By documenting patterns of retaliation, providing legal and financial resources, and connecting affected students with support networks, we were creating accountability where none had existed before. Within 6 months, we documented over 400 cases of potential retaliation at universities nationwide. Stanford alone accounted for 17 cases, with Derek Hawthorne's name appearing in 7 of them. The breakthrough came when Dr. Angela Foster, an investigative journalist specializing in higher education corruption, discovered our database. She'd been working independently on a story about donor influence on university disciplinary processes, but had struggled to find systematic evidence of abuse. "This is the missing piece," she told us during our first meeting. "I've been tracking financial irregularities and favoritism, but I needed documentation of systematic retaliation. Your data provides exactly that." Dr. Foster spent 3 months cross-referencing our database with her own research, interviews with affected students, and internal university documents obtained through public records requests. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of corruption that went far beyond individual cases of harassment or misconduct. The Stanford expose was published on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after my graduation. The headline read, "The Hawthorne Effect: How Donor Influence Corrupts Student Justice at America's Elite Universities." The article was devastating in its scope and precision. It detailed 17 specific cases of students who'd faced retaliation after filing complaints against Derek Hawthorne or other administrative officials connected to major donors. It revealed internal emails showing Derek's father pressuring university leadership to minimize investigations into his son's behavior. Most damning of all, it exposed the scholarship revocation system Derek had been using as a weapon against students who'd crossed him. My case was featured prominently not just as another example of retaliation, but as the catalyst that had led to the broader investigation. Dr. Foster had meticulously documented every aspect of Derek's harassment, my complaint to Dean Williams, and the suspicious timing of my scholarship revocation. The university's response was swift and panicked. Within hours of the article's publication, Dean Williams called an emergency press conference, promising a full investigation and immediate policy reforms. By afternoon, Derek had been placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive review. By evening, the Hawthorne Foundation had issued a statement distancing themselves from their son's actions while reaffirming their commitment to appropriate conduct. But the real fireworks were just beginning. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7 a.m. The caller ID showed Stanford University, specifically Dean Williams' direct line. "Miss Rodriguez, this is Dean Williams. I hope you're well," she began, her voice carrying a careful formality that contrasted sharply with the warmth she'd shown during our initial meetings. "I'm doing very well, thank you," I replied, putting the call on speaker so James could hear from his position at our shared workspace. "I'm calling because the university would like to discuss resolving the issues raised in yesterday's article. After a thorough review of your file, we've determined that there may have been some procedural irregularities in how your scholarship situation was handled." James raised his eyebrows at the careful language. Stanford was essentially admitting fault while trying to avoid saying so directly. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. "Well, it appears that your scholarship revocation may have been processed without proper authorization and review. We'd like to offer full reinstatement of your scholarship status, retroactive to your graduation date, plus compensation for any financial hardship you may have experienced." The offer was stunning in its scope. Stanford was essentially trying to undo Derek's retaliation while providing substantial additional compensation. "That's interesting," I replied carefully. "What kind of compensation are we discussing?" "We're prepared to offer a full refund of any amounts you paid to clear your account, plus an additional scholarship fund that would cover graduate school tuition should you choose to pursue advanced studies at Stanford. The total package would be valued at approximately $400,000. James was furiously taking notes, calculating the implications of such an offer. Stanford wasn't just trying to make me whole. They were trying to buy my silence and cooperation. "I appreciate the generous offer," I said, "but I'm quite satisfied with my current professional situation. However, I am very interested in discussing how Stanford plans to address the systematic issues raised in the article." Dean Williams' tone shifted, becoming more desperate. "We're implementing comprehensive reforms to our disciplinary and financial aid processes. We'd welcome your input on those changes. Perhaps we could arrange for you to serve as a consultant on best practices for protecting vulnerable students." This was exactly what James and I had anticipated. The university wasn't just trying to resolve my individual case. They were recognizing that our database and platform represented a threat to universities nationwide that were dealing with similar problems. I'd be willing to discuss consulting arrangements, I said, but any such discussion would need to include my business partner and our legal team. We're not just talking about Stanford's issues, but about systematic reform across higher education. After ending the call, James and I looked at each other with matching expressions of amazement and determination. "They're terrified," he said. "The article was just the beginning. They know we have documentation on dozens of other cases, and they know this story is going to spread to other universities." He was absolutely right. Over the following weeks, Stanford wasn't the only institution reaching out. Universities across the country facing scrutiny due to our database revelations wanted to hire us as consultants to reform their student disciplinary and financial aid processes. What had started as a response to Derek's retaliation had evolved into a full-fledged business opportunity. Educational Equity Solutions, our consulting firm, was booked solid within 2 months of the article's publication. Universities were paying substantial fees for our expertise in identifying and preventing the kind of systematic abuse that Derek had exemplified. But the most satisfying development came in December, exactly 1 year after Derek had first begun his inappropriate pursuit. James and I were preparing for a presentation to the California State University system when my personal phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Isabella, this is Derek. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize for everything that happened. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I've been in therapy, and I'm trying to make amends. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand how much I hurt you." I showed the message to James, who shook his head in disbelief. "He still doesn't get it," James said. "This isn't about hurting your feelings. This is about systematic abuse of power, institutional corruption, and the vulnerability of students who don't have resources to protect themselves." I agreed, but something about the timing of Derek's message intrigued me. He'd been completely silent since being placed on administrative leave. Why reach out now? Wow, and why, with such a carefully worded apology? A little research revealed the answer. Derek hadn't just been fired from his position at Stanford. He was facing criminal charges. Dr. Foster's investigation had uncovered evidence that Derek had used his position to coerce sexual favors from multiple students over several years. 3 women had come forward with allegations, and Derek was facing felony charges for abuse of power and sexual coercion. The apology text wasn't genuine remorse. It was part of his legal strategy to demonstrate rehabilitation and remorse before sentencing. His lawyers had probably advised him to reach out to his victims as evidence of his commitment to making amends. I crafted my response carefully, wanting to acknowledge his message while making clear that real accountability required more than personal apologies. "Derek, I'm glad you're getting professional help. Real change requires acknowledging not just that you hurt individuals, but that you systematically abused institutional power to harm vulnerable students. If you're truly committed to making amends, consider using your experience to help reform the systems that enabled your behavior. The students who come after us deserve better protection than we had." I never received a reply. 3 months later, Derek was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and lifetime banishment from any role in higher education administration. His father quietly removed the Hawthorne Foundation's support from Stanford and several other universities where Derek had worked. The family's attempt to buy influence and protection had ultimately resulted in complete disgrace and financial loss. But Derek's downfall, satisfying as it was, wasn't the real victory. The real triumph was what we'd built from the wreckage of his attempt to destroy me. Educational Equity Solutions had grown to 15 full-time employees and was working with over 100 universities nationwide. Our database had documented more than 2,000 cases of potential administrative retaliation, leading to policy changes, personnel terminations, and millions of dollars in settlements for affected students. More importantly, we'd created a support network that meant students like me would never again face retaliation alone and defenseless. Every case we handled, every policy we helped reform, every corrupt administrator we helped remove, made the system a little bit safer for the next generation of vulnerable students. The consulting firm's success allowed me to pay back every penny James had advanced for my debt, plus substantial interest. But when I offered repayment, he refused to accept it. "You turned your worst day into the foundation for all of this," he said, gesturing around our new offices in downtown San Francisco. "The least I can do is make sure we have the resources to help others do the same." Instead of accepting repayment, James suggested we formalize our partnership structure and reinvest the money in expanding our services. We hired additional investigators, policy analysts, and victim advocates. We developed new technology platforms for tracking misconduct and connecting students with resources. We established a legal defense fund for students facing retaliation. 2 years after graduation, I received another call from Stanford. This time, it was from the new Dean of Student Affairs, Dr. Williams, having been quietly reassigned to a less visible role in university relations. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm calling to discuss a different kind of opportunity. The Board of Trustees is creating a new position, Director of Student Equity and Institutional Reform. It would be a senior administrative role with significant autonomy to investigate complaints and implement systematic changes across all university departments. We'd like to offer you the position. I nearly laughed out loud. Stanford wanted to hire me to do the job Derek should have been doing all along, protecting students instead of preying on them. I'm flattered by the offer, I replied, but I'm not interested in leaving my current position. My work with educational equity solutions allows me to create change across the entire higher education landscape, not just at one institution. However, our firm would be happy to bid on a comprehensive consulting contract to help Stanford implement the reforms you're describing. The consulting contract we eventually signed was worth more than Derek's father had ever donated to the university in a single year. The irony was perfect. The Hawthorne family's attempt to buy power and silence had ultimately funded the dismantling of the very systems they'd tried to exploit. But the story doesn't end with financial success or professional vindication. The real conclusion came when I had the opportunity to return to Stanford under completely different circumstances. Last month, 18 months after Derek's sentencing and 3 years after my graduation, I received an invitation that completed the circle in ways I never could have imagined. Stanford was hosting a national symposium on preventing administrative misconduct in higher education, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote address. I accepted, partly out of professional obligation, but mostly because I wanted to stand on that same stage where I'd received my diploma and tell a completely different story about what triumph really looks like. The auditorium was packed with administrators from universities nationwide, researchers studying institutional corruption, legal advocates specializing in student rights, and dozens of students who'd been inspired by our work to speak up about their own experiences with retaliation and abuse. As I looked out at the audience, I spotted several familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Dr. Foster, whose investigation had sparked the broader movement for reform, and who was now writing a book about donor influence in higher education. Sarah Martinez, who joined Educational Equity Solutions and was now leading our policy development team. Kevin Washington, who'd become our chief legal counsel and was pioneering new approaches to student rights advocacy. And there, in the back row, was my mother, wearing her nursing scrubs after finishing a night shift, but determined not to miss her daughter's speech at the university that had tried to destroy our family's dreams. 3 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. I stood on a stage not far from here, believing that my education was complete and my future was secure. Within hours of that graduation ceremony, I learned that institutional power could be wielded as a weapon against the most vulnerable students, and that even perfect academic performance couldn't protect you from systematic retaliation. I paused, letting the words sink in, while making eye contact with administrators I recognized from the audience. But I also learned something else that day. I learned that our greatest victories often emerge from our most devastating defeats. Not because suffering makes us stronger, that's a dangerous myth that keeps victims silent, but because betrayal can reveal truths that success obscures, and crisis can create opportunities that comfort never could. I spent the next 45 minutes detailing the journey from Derek's harassment to our consulting firm's national impact, but I was careful to focus on the systematic issues rather than personal revenge. I talked about the importance of building institutions that protect students rather than administrators. I challenged the audience to examine their own universities for signs of corruption and abuse. I presented data showing how donor influence created vulnerabilities that enabled predators like Derek. Most importantly, I talked about transformation, how individual acts of courage can create ripple effects that reshape entire industries. Derek Hawthorne thought he was ending my story when he revoked my scholarship, I said, approaching the conclusion of my speech. Instead, he was beginning a story much larger than either of us could have imagined. A story about what happens when students refuse to be silenced, when entrepreneurs see opportunity in injustice, and when institutions are forced to choose between reform and irrelevance. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but the real measure of success came afterward during the reception. Student after student approached me with their own stories of institutional retaliation and their plans to fight back using the resources we'd created. One young woman, barely 18, and clearly nervous about speaking to a stranger, approached me near the end of the evening. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm a freshman here at Stanford, and I wanted to thank you for what you've built," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm dealing with a situation with a professor who's been inappropriate with several students in our program, and I was afraid to report it because I've heard stories about what happens to students who complain. But after hearing your speech tonight, I think I'm ready to file a complaint." I gave her my business card and connected her immediately with our support network. Within a week, she'd filed a formal complaint with university administrators and was working with our legal team to ensure her protection from retaliation. 3 months later, that professor had been terminated. 2 other students had come forward with similar complaints, and the young woman was thriving in her studies, no longer afraid to advocate for herself and others. That conversation reminded me why Derek's betrayal had ultimately been a gift, wrapped in the cruelest possible packaging. It forced me to discover reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. It connected me with allies I never would have found otherwise. and it revealed a mission I never would have chosen, but now couldn't imagine abandoning. But the story I'm telling you isn't just about personal transformation or professional success. It's about understanding power, how it works, how it's abused, and how it can be redistributed to protect those who need protection most. 6 months after the Stanford Symposium, I received a phone call that brought the Derek Hawthorne chapter of my life to its final close. The caller was Marcus Hawthorne, Derek's father and the patriarch of the family whose wealth and influence had enabled Derek's abuse for so many years. "Miss Rodriguez, this is Marcus Hawthorne," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to making apologies. "I wanted to speak with you personally about my son's behavior and its impact on your life." I was surprised by the call, but not entirely unprepared for it. Our investigative work had revealed that Derek's criminal behavior hadn't occurred in isolation. It was part of a pattern of entitlement and abuse that the Hawthorne family had enabled through their wealth and influence. "I appreciate you reaching out, Mr. Hawthorne," I replied carefully. "Miss Rodriguez, I want you to know that I've spent considerable time over the past year reflecting on my family's role in what happened to you and other students. My son's actions were inexcusable, but they didn't occur in a vacuum. The power and influence our family wielded created an environment where Derek believed he was above accountability. His acknowledgement was more direct than I'd expected, but I remained cautious about his motivations. What I'm calling to propose," he continued, "is a way for the Hawthorne Foundation to make meaningful amends for the harm we've caused. Not through personal payments or settlements, but through systematic change that addresses the root causes of the problems Derek exemplified." Marcus went on to outline a proposal that was genuinely surprising in its scope and sophistication. The Hawthorne Foundation wanted to fund a major expansion of educational equity solutions, specifically focusing on creating oversight and accountability mechanisms for donor influence at universities nationwide. "The irony isn't lost on me," Marcus admitted. "Our family's wealth enabled my son's abuse, and now we want to use that same wealth to prevent others from doing what he did. But I believe meaningful change requires those who benefited from broken systems to help fix them." The proposal included a $50 million commitment over 5 years, with funding structured to ensure complete independence for our organization. The Hawthorne Foundation would have no control over our operations, investigations, or recommendations. They would simply provide resources for us to expand our work protecting vulnerable students from exactly the kind of abuse Derek had perpetrated. "Why would you do this?" I asked. "Your family has already paid an enormous price for Derek's actions. Your reputation has been damaged, your influence diminished. Why risk further association with these issues?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm 73 years old. I built my wealth believing that success meant accumulating power and influence. I used that power to protect my son when he should have faced consequences for his actions. The result was that Derek never learned accountability. Other students suffered harm that could have been prevented, and our family's legacy became associated with corruption rather than contribution." He paused, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "I can't undo the harm Derek caused, and I can't change the ways our family enabled that harm. But I can use whatever years I have left and whatever resources I've accumulated to ensure that no other family makes the same mistakes. More importantly, I can help ensure that no other students face the vulnerability you experienced." The offer was tempting beyond anything I could have imagined when Derek first sent that scholarship revocation email. $50 million would allow us to expand our operations nationally, hire the best investigators and advocates, and create technology platforms that could protect millions of students. But accepting money from the Hawthorne Foundation, even with complete operational independence, would create complicated optics and potential conflicts of interest. "Mr. Hawthorne, I appreciate the generous offer and the spirit behind it," I said after considering his proposal carefully. "But I don't think direct funding from your foundation would be appropriate given our organization's mission and the history involved." I could hear disappointment in his voice as he accepted my decision, but I wasn't finished. "However," I continued, "there might be a different approach that could achieve your goals while maintaining appropriate boundaries. What if the Hawthorne Foundation funded an independent organization specifically focused on university accountability, with educational equity solutions serving as consultants rather than direct recipients?" The alternative structure I proposed would create a new nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing donor abuse and institutional corruption. The Hawthorne Foundation would provide funding, but governance would be completely independent, with board members selected by academic institutions, student advocacy groups, and civil rights organizations. Educational Equity Solutions would serve as the primary consulting firm for this new organization, but our independence would be preserved and our credibility protected. Other firms and experts could also be contracted, ensuring that the work wouldn't be dependent on any single organization. "That's actually a much better approach," Marcus agreed after I'd outlined the structure. "It addresses my concerns about accountability while preserving your organization's independence and credibility." The result was the creation of the University Accountability Foundation, an independent nonprofit that has become the premier organization for investigating and preventing corruption in higher education. Marcus kept his word about independence. The Hawthorne family has no control over the organization's operations, and they've never attempted to influence our work, even when our investigations have been critical of their past actions. The expansion this funding enabled has been extraordinary. Educational Equity Solutions now has offices in 12 cities and works with over 400 universities nationwide. We've documented more than 10,000 cases of potential misconduct, leading to hundreds of policy changes, dozens of criminal prosecutions, and systematic reforms that have made higher education significantly safer for vulnerable students. But the numbers, impressive as they are, don't capture the real impact of what we've built. The statistic I'm most proud of is this: not a single student who's used our support network has been successfully silenced by institutional retaliation. Not one. Every time a student facing harassment can access our resources, every time a corrupt administrator is removed from power, every time a university implements policies that protect rather than exploit students, we're proving that Derek's attempt to destroy me ultimately created something far more powerful than he ever imagined. The personal satisfaction of this transformation is matched by the professional opportunities it's created. Last year, I was invited to testify before Congress about the need for federal oversight of university disciplinary processes. The month before that, I delivered the commencement address at UC Berkeley, speaking to graduating seniors about the importance of using their education to protect those who come after them. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 2 months ago, I received a letter from Stanford University's new president, Dr. Sandra Chen, no relation to James. The letter informed me that Stanford was creating the Isabella Rodriguez Center for Student Equity and Institutional Reform, a permanent research institute dedicated to studying and preventing the kind of abuse I'd experienced. Your experience at Stanford represents both our greatest failure and our most important lesson, Dr. Chen wrote. This center will ensure that future students never face the vulnerability you experienced, and that your courage in speaking out continues to protect others long into the future. The center, which will be housed in a new building on Stanford's campus, will conduct research on power dynamics in higher education, train administrators on ethical conduct, and provide resources for students facing institutional retaliation. It will be funded not by wealthy donors seeking influence, but by alumni contributions specifically designated for student protection. When I visited the construction site last month, I was struck by the symbolism of what was being built. Where Derek had once tried to use institutional power to silence and control students, there would now be a permanent resource dedicated to empowering and protecting them. Standing there, watching construction workers lay the foundation for something that would outlast all of us, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3.5 years earlier, I'd stood in that same area, reading Derek's scholarship revocation email, feeling powerless and betrayed. Now, I was watching the construction of an institution that would ensure no other student would face that same vulnerability alone. But this story isn't really about revenge, even though Derek certainly got what he deserved. It's not even about personal success, though I've been blessed with opportunities beyond anything I could have imagined as a kid in East LA. This story is about understanding that our worst moments often contain the seeds of our greatest contributions. That betrayal can reveal truths we would never have discovered otherwise. That crisis can create opportunities that comfort never could. Most importantly, it's about recognizing that true power isn't the ability to destroy others. It's the ability to build something so meaningful that destruction becomes impossible. Derek thought he was teaching me a lesson about power when he revoked my scholarship. He was right that he was teaching me about power, but the lesson wasn't what he intended. He taught me that power derived from wealth and connections is ultimately fragile, dependent on systems and relationships that can change. But power derived from competence, integrity, and service to others is unshakable. Today, Educational Equity Solutions has helped over 50,000 students navigate institutional challenges and retaliation. We've facilitated hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and policy changes. We've seen corrupt administrators removed and protective systems implemented at universities across the country. But beyond the professional achievements, this experience taught me something even more valuable about the nature of justice and redemption. Real victory isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building something so meaningful that your enemies become irrelevant footnotes in a much larger story. Derek Hawthorne is serving his prison sentence in federal custody, his name permanently associated with abuse and corruption. His father has spent the remainder of his life trying to make amends for enabling that abuse. The Hawthorne family's influence in higher education has been permanently diminished. But none of that matters as much as the fact that tens of thousands of students are safer because Derek's cruelty revealed the need for systematic change. His attempt to silence one student ultimately gave voice to thousands. That's his true legacy, not the lives he tried to ruin, but the movement he accidentally inspired, the systems he forced us to build, and the countless students who are protected because his abuse revealed the need for reform. If you've made it this far in my story, you might be wondering whether you could show similar resilience in my situation. Whether you'd be able to transform retaliation into revolution, betrayal into business opportunity, personal pain into systematic change. The truth is, I don't know if I would have found the same strength if James hadn't appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right opportunity. But I do know that opportunities like that only emerge when we're prepared to recognize and seize them. What I can tell you is this. The next time someone tries to use their power to silence or diminish you, remember that their ability to hurt you is temporary, but your ability to learn, adapt, and build something meaningful from that experience is permanent. Derek thought he was writing the ending to my story when he sent that scholarship revocation email. Instead, he was providing the opening chapter for a story much larger than either of us could have imagined. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's building something so much bigger than your original vision that your betrayers become footnotes in a story they never could have imagined helping to write. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very persistent, you get to stand in front of an audience of future leaders and tell them that their worst day might just be the beginning of their most important work. That's the story I want you to remember. Not the harassment or retaliation or institutional corruption, but the transformation that emerged from crisis. Not the abuse of power, but the redistribution of power that made the abuse impossible to repeat. Derek Hawthorne gave me a gift, wrapped in the cruelest possible packaging. He showed me what my life's work would be, even though that wasn't his intention. He connected me with allies I never would have found otherwise. He revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. Most importantly, he taught me that sometimes our greatest contributions emerge from our deepest wounds, and that the people who try to destroy us often end up creating exactly what the world needs most. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever turned betrayal into opportunity? Have you built something meaningful from the ashes of someone else's cruelty? Share your stories, because every time someone transforms pain into purpose, it makes it easier for the next person to do the same. And remember, the next time someone tries to write the ending to your story, you have the power to start a completely different chapter instead. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that begin with, "You're fired," and end with, "You're hired," to change everything.